Hello everyone, this is Nashmiya. Today we will present the result of our survey about primitive recursive function. The first introduced of primitive recursion was as a method by Richard Didkin in 1888 and was explored in much more detail by Skolem, Ackerman, and Peter in the 1920s and 1930s. Okay, what is the primitive recursion? A primitive recursion is a strategy that allows to define function by descending recursion in one variable, or to phrase it in essential paradigm. Can we enumerate primitive recursive function? Stephen Cars answers this question in his paper, The Primitive Recursive Functions Are Recursively Enumerable. He proves the theorem that any co-semi-decidable equivalent causes a construction that enumerates canonical representative of equivalence classes of the relation. That means we can enumerate the primitive recursive function without semantic redundancy. So, what is the co-semi-decidable equivalent? He defined the co-semi-decidable of relation, which means there is a computable procedure that stop and return false for all objects are not belongs to this relation, and otherwise is not defined, which is not stop. And also he defined that a function f is called canonical enumeration, which is if return only canonical representative of equivalence classes and also find all equivalence classes.
Hello everyone, I'm Razan. The subtitle of this section is Linear Primitive Recursive Functions. In this research paper, the linear primitive recursive scheme defined with having three attributes. The first one is initial functions, which are the natural numbers built from 0 and the successor function s, and the identity function id. The second attribute is linear composition, and the third attribute is pure iteration. Linear recursive functions paper illustrates that how to convert from primitive to linear primitive and back. The first feature in both primitive recursive and linear primitive recursive is the same, which is to represent all natural numbers using 0 and successor function. Then projection is equivalent to permutations and linear erasing. Composition is equivalent to linear composition, linear copying, and linear erasing. Recursive scheme is equivalent to pure iteration, linear copying, and linear erasing. In converting from linear primitive to primitive, linear primitive recursive feature, which is identity function, is equivalent to projection. Linear composition is equivalent to composition and projection, and pure iteration is equivalent to recursive scheme and projection. The conclusion of this paper shows that every primitive recursive function is linear primitive recursive and vice versa, which means that they are equal to each other.
Hi, I am Kavya. My paper talks about the complexity of representation of a primitive recursive function with respect to genetic programming or automatically defined functions is invariant. Genetic programming is used to represent the solutions in the form of a tree graph. The extension of this representation is automatically defined functions. It has the ability to express the functions in a model. The complexity of a function is independent of the primitive set if the representation has the ability to express modules. But genetic programming is not capable of expressing recursion. However, a few researchers have introduced recursion into their representation. These representations are then capable of expressing a wider classes of functions. The authors have proved that the two given representations, that is, genetic programming and automatically defined functions, the complexity of functions with respect to of these representations is invariant.
In conclusion, primitive recursive functions are recursively enumerable. Primitive recursive function can syntactically expressed in linear system. Primitive recursive function can also represent in genetic programming and automatically defined functions. The complexity of representation of the primitive recursive function with respect to genetic programming or automatically defined function is invariant. Thank you.